The comment was not meant to be heard by everyone in the room. That was the first thing Harold Vance thought, sitting in the front row of the Jasper County Zoning Board hearing room on a Tuesday evening in October of 2022, when the man in the gray suit leaned toward the younger man beside him and said it. The comment was made at a volume calibrated for a table conversation, not a public meeting, and the man who said it had made a slight error in his calibration of the room's acoustics, which happened to be excellent, having been designed for a building that also hosted county concerts and community theater, and that therefore reflected sound with a clarity that the man in the gray suit had not anticipated. What he said was, "People like you don't belong in a room like this." He said it while Harold was at the microphone, 3 minutes into his 5-minute public comment period, citing the drainage tile records he had maintained on his 240 acres in southern Jasper County since 1981, and the man in the gray suit said it to his colleague, but said it loud enough that the court reporter at the side table looked up, and that the zoning board chairman, a man named Dale Birch, who had been farming in Jasper County for 40 years before he took the appointed position, tilted his head in the specific way that a man tilts his head when he has heard something that he intends to remember. Harold Vance finished his 5-minute comment. He said what he had come to say about the drainage patterns in the lower section of his property and what he had observed across 41 years of maintaining the tile drainage system that his father had installed in 1963, and about what he believed those drainage patterns indicated about the likely groundwater impact of the proposed Meridian Agri-Systems confined animal feeding operation on the adjacent 216 acres that Meridian had purchased the previous year. He said it in the measured, specific language of a man who had prepared his comment carefully and who knew that 5 minutes was not enough time for everything he had brought and was sufficient time for what mattered most. He thanked the board. He sat down. The man in the gray suit was Graham Coulter, the Chief Executive Officer of Meridian Agri-Systems LLC, a mid-sized agribusiness company headquartered in Des Moines that had been expanding its confined animal feeding operations across central Iowa for the past 6 years. Graham Coulter was 47 years old, held an MBA from the University of Iowa, and had been managing Meridian's growth strategy since 2016, with the specific efficiency of a man who understood capital markets and regulatory processes, and had a team of attorneys and environmental consultants whose job was to navigate the second of those two things smoothly enough that they did not slow down the first. He was not accustomed to being the second most prepared person in a county zoning hearing room. Harold Vance had made him the second most prepared person in the room. Harold was 68 years old. He had been farming the 240 acres his grandfather had homesteaded in Jasper County since he was 26, when his father had handed the operation to him with the specific directness of a man who believed in transfer rather than inheritance, which was to say Harold had worked for the farm through his 20s and had paid fair value for it over 15 years, and had understood that the work was not a gift. He had been farming it since then, corn and soybeans in the standard Iowa rotation, with the specific modification that he had been running a cover crop program since 2009 and had been no-tilling his most erodible fields since 2014, and had been keeping a drainage tile performance log since 1981, because his father had kept one and had told Harold to continue it because the information was useful and because you never knew when you were going to need it. He had not known in 1981 that he was going to need it in 2022 to address the drainage impact of a confined animal feeding operation proposed for the adjacent property. But the log was there. 41 years of twice-yearly readings at 12 monitoring points along the main tile lines on the east and west sections of his property, recording the flow rates and the water quality indicators at each point, and the dates and the rainfall conditions and the seasonal variations. And when Meridian Agri-Systems had purchased the adjacent property in the fall of 2021 and filed the initial CAFO permit application with the Iowa Department of Natural Resources in March of 2022, Harold had pulled the tile log and had begun reading it with the specific attention of a man who understood that it was about to become relevant in a way it had never been before. The Iowa CAFO permit process used a scoring system called the Master Matrix, a set of criteria by which proposed confined animal feeding operations were evaluated against factors including separation distances, drainage management, topography, and proximity to waterways and tile drainage systems. The Master Matrix was a public document, and Harold had downloaded it from the Iowa DNR website and had read it carefully, and had then driven to Newton and spent 2 afternoons at the Jasper County Assessor's Office reviewing the topographic maps and drainage records for the adjacent parcel, and had then retained a drainage engineer from Ames named Karen Sue to review his tile log data and his observations about the drainage relationship between his property and the adjacent parcel. Karen Sue had come to the farm in June of 2022 and had spent a full day with Harold, reviewing the tile log and walking the field boundaries and examining the drainage infrastructure and taking measurements at several points where his tile system interacted with the property boundary of the Meridian parcel. She had written a 9-page technical assessment that described the drainage hydrology between the 2 parcels in specific terms, identified 3 locations where the proposed CAFO waste lagoon and application area would be upstream in the tile drainage catchment from Harold's system, and concluded that the Meridian application as filed did not adequately address the drainage interaction between the proposed operation and the existing agricultural drainage infrastructure on the adjacent property. The technical assessment had been submitted as a formal comment on the Meridian permit application to the Iowa DNR in August of 2022, along with the 41 years of tile log data and the topographic analysis that Karen Sue had prepared. The DNR had acknowledged receipt and had indicated that the comment would be considered in the permit review process. Graham Coulter's attorneys had responded to Karen Sue's assessment in September, with a counter-analysis prepared by a consulting firm that worked extensively with Iowa CAFO permit applications, and that argued, in technical language that was thorough and professionally competent, that the drainage interaction identified in Sue's assessment was within the acceptable parameters of the Master Matrix scoring system, and that the proposed operation met all applicable requirements. The Jasper County Zoning Board hearing on October 18th was not the permit hearing, which was before the Iowa DNR, but a separate county-level review required for conditional use approval on the proposed site. It was at this county hearing that Harold had presented his 5-minute comment, and at which Graham Coulter, arriving with 2 attorneys and a consultant, and the confidence of a man who had navigated 17 previous CAFO permit processes in Iowa without significant delay, had leaned toward his colleague and made the comment that the acoustics of the Jasper County meeting room had distributed to approximately 40 people. Dale Birch, the zoning board chairman, had heard it. He had not addressed it during the hearing because addressing it during the hearing would have been procedurally inappropriate, and Dale Birch was a precise man in procedural matters. He had addressed it after the hearing, in the parking lot, when he walked up to Harold and said that he had heard what was said, and that he wanted Harold to know that the board had also heard it, and that the board's view was that Harold had belonged in that room with exactly the preparation he had brought to it. Harold had thanked Dale and had driven home on the county road, and had called his daughter in Ames and told her about the evening. She had asked if he was going to do anything about the comment. Harold had said he was going to continue the permit process through the established channels, which was what he had been doing, and that the comment did not change what the tile data showed or what Karen Sue's assessment documented. His daughter had said, "Dad, someone recorded it." Harold had asked what she meant. Harold. She said a woman in the second row had been recording the public comment session on her phone for her own reference, and had caught the comment on the recording and had asked Dale Birch after the meeting whether it was appropriate to submit the recording to the county as part of the official meeting record. Dale Birch had said yes. The recording circulated in Jasper County in the specific way that recordings of things said by powerful people to less powerful people circulated in rural counties in the early 2020s, which was to say, it was on social media by the following morning and had been shared several hundred times by Thursday. and had been referenced in a story in the Newton Daily News by Friday, which quoted the county zoning board chairman as saying that the board considered the comment inappropriate, and that the farmer who had been addressed had presented one of the most thorough and well-documented public comments on a land use matter that the board had received in his 9 years of service. The Newton Daily News story was picked up by the Des Moines Register on Saturday. Graham Coulter issued a statement through Meridian's communications office on Sunday, saying that the comment had been taken out of context and that Meridian respected all stakeholders in the permit review process. The statement was not well received in Jasper County or in the comments section of the Des Moines Register story, and by Monday the story had reached several national agricultural publications and one cable news segment on rural land use disputes in Iowa. Harold was not on social media and had not seen the recording or the coverage until his neighbor Daryl stopped at the farm on Wednesday morning and showed it to him on his phone. Harold had watched the clip, which was 9 seconds long, and showed Graham Coulter's profile and a partial view of Harold at the microphone, and had heard the comment with the specific quality of attention of a man who had already processed it once in real time and was now processing it a second time with the additional context of knowing that other people had heard it and were responding to it. He had said, "I see," and had thanked Daryl and had gone back to work. The Iowa Secretary of Agriculture, a man named Robert Fenn, who had been in the position for 4 years and who had grown up on a row crop operation in Polk County and who understood the specific dynamics of CAFO permit disputes in Iowa, with the practical fluency of someone who had been managing them in a professional context for most of his adult life, had called Harold on Thursday of that same week. He had introduced himself and had said he had seen the coverage and had reviewed the permit application and the comment record and Karen Sue's technical assessment, and had a few questions he wanted to ask Harold directly if Harold was willing to talk. Harold had said yes. They had talked for 45 minutes. Robert Fenn had asked specific questions about the tile log methodology and the monitoring point locations and the drainage engineering assessment and the relationship between the proposed lagoon placement and the upstream catchment area that Karen Sue had identified. Harold had answered all of them from memory, not because he had memorized the data, but because he had been living with it for 41 years, and the specific numbers at the specific monitoring points in the specific seasonal conditions were part of the working knowledge of his own farm, in the same way that a doctor knows the vital signs of a long-term patient. At the end of the conversation, Robert Fenn had asked Harold if he would be willing to have a formal site visit with the DNR's drainage engineering staff and a representative from the Secretary's office to walk the drainage infrastructure and review the monitoring points in person. Harold had said yes. The site visit happened on a Tuesday morning in November, 3 weeks after the zoning board hearing. Robert Fenn came himself, which Harold had not expected, along with 2 DNR drainage engineers and Karen Sue, who Harold had asked to be present. They spent 4 hours on the farm, walking the tile lines and the monitoring points and the field boundaries, and the area where the catchment from the Meridian parcel drained into Harold's system. Robert Fenn had asked to see the tile log. Harold had brought all 41 years of it, the original handwritten notebooks and the spreadsheet he had transferred the data into in 2008, and he had laid them on the tailgate of his truck at the field boundary, and the DNR engineers had spent 40 minutes reviewing them, while Robert Fenn stood beside Harold at the fence line, looking at the adjacent parcel where the Meridian operation was proposed. Fenn had said, "How long has this tile system been in place?" Harold said his father had installed the main lines in 1963, and he had extended them in 1987 and 1994. He said the system had been managing the drainage on this property for 60 years. Fenn had said, "And you have been monitoring it since 1981. Harold said yes. He said his father had started the log in 1981, and he had continued it after his father retired. He said it was the kind of record that was useful to have when decisions were being made about adjacent land use, and that he had maintained it for that reason, among others. Fenn had looked at the adjacent parcel for a while. Then he had said that he wanted to be direct with Harold about something. He said the permit process had formal channels, and that those channels needed to be respected, and that he was not at the site visit to predetermine any outcome. He said he was at the site visit because the technical documentation in the comment record was the most thorough drainage impact analysis he had seen submitted by a private citizen in a CAFO permit review in Iowa. And because the comments submitted to the county record about people like you not belonging in a room like that was not consistent with his understanding of who belonged in a room like that, which was anyone with specific factual knowledge of the local conditions relevant to a permit decision and the documented evidence to support it. Harold had not said anything for a moment. Then he had said he appreciated that. Fenn had driven back to Des Moines that afternoon and had issued a formal statement the following morning from the Secretary of Agriculture's office, stating that the Iowa DNR permit review process for the Meridian Agri-Systems application would include a full independent drainage engineering assessment of the tile system interactions identified in the citizen comment record, and that this assessment would be completed before any permit decision was made, and that the quality and duration of the drainage monitoring documentation submitted by the adjacent property owner represented exactly the kind of local operational knowledge that the permit review process was designed to incorporate, and that the Secretary's office considered fundamental to sound agricultural land use decisions in Iowa. The statement was reported in the Des Moines Register under the headline, Secretary of Agriculture, CITES Farmers 41-year record in CAFO review decision. The independent drainage assessment that the DNR subsequently commissioned, conducted by an engineering firm from Iowa City that had no prior relationship with either Meridian or Harold, confirmed Karen Sue's analysis. It found that the proposed lagoon siting and the waste application area, as designed in the original permit application, did not adequately account for the subsurface drainage relationship between the Meridian parcel and the adjacent tile system, and recommended a series of design modifications that would require relocating the primary lagoon and substantially redesigning the application area. Meridian Agri-Systems withdrew the permit application in February of 2023 and filed a revised application in August of the same year that incorporated the drainage modifications recommended by the independent assessment. The revised application was a substantially different project from the original and addressed the specific concerns that Karen Sue's assessment and Harold's tile log data had identified. Graham Coulter had not commented publicly on the outcome. His communications office had issued a brief statement saying that Meridian was committed to responsible agricultural development and looked forward to continuing the permit process with the revised application. Harold had read the statement in the farm office one morning in late February and had set it down and had gone out to check the tile line monitoring points at the east end of the property, which he did twice a year in late February and late August, regardless of what else was happening in the broader world that touched his farm. He walked the monitoring points in the February cold, the ground still frozen at the surface and the tile lines running at the rate appropriate for late winter. And he took the readings and wrote them in the current notebook, the 43rd in the series his father had started in 1981, in the same format his father had used, and that he had used for 41 years since, dates and flow rates and water quality observations at each monitoring point. At the last monitoring point, the one at the southeast corner of the east section that was closest to the Meridian property boundary, he stood for a while and looked at the adjacent parcel where the original operation had been proposed and where the revised application now described a different layout. He did not feel vindicated in any particular way that required a response or an expression. He felt the specific quiet satisfaction of a man whose careful work had been seen and understood by the right people at the right time, and who had known before it was seen and understood that it was worth seeing and worth understanding. He wrote the reading in the notebook and closed it, and walked back to the truck. The next monitoring reading would be in August. He would walk the same points in the same format and write the numbers in the same notebook, because that was what the record required. And because the record was not about the Meridian dispute, or the Secretary's statement, or the 9-second recording, or the comment in the county meeting room. The record was about his farm and what his farm's drainage was doing across time. And the meridian situation had been one instance in which the record was needed in a way he had not anticipated. But the record was not the meridian situation, and the meridian situation was not the record. His father had started the log in 1981 because drainage information was useful to have. Harold had continued it because his father had started it, and because the principle was sound, and because 41 years of evidence had confirmed that the principle was sound in ways his father had not specifically anticipated. He drove back to the farmhouse on the county road in the February cold and put the truck in the barn and went inside and put the kettle on. The current notebook was on the desk. The 42 notebooks before it were on the shelf in the farm office, the oldest ones in his father's handwriting, the rest in his own. When the current notebook was done, there would be a 44th. The record continued. The farm continued. Those two things were not separate. Harold Vance had been the kind of farmer who was easy to underestimate at a distance. This was partly a matter of appearance. He was not a large man, had never been physically imposing, and the 42 years of farming had done to him what farming does to most men who do it without complaint through the full range of what the seasons produce, which was to reduce him to something lean and deliberate and economical of motion, without the performance of capability that some men developed to compensate for not having it, and without the need to announce capability that some men never outgrew. He wore the same clothes he had always worn, which were the clothes appropriate for the work, and he drove a truck that was 11 years old and kept in good repair, and he spoke in the specific direct way of a man who said what he meant without decoration, because he had learned that decoration was for people who were uncertain about the substance. He had been uncertain about the substance occasionally across 42 years of farming. The drought years of 2012 and 2013 had been difficult in ways that went beyond the financial. The year his father had passed, 2017, had been difficult in the specific way that the loss of the person who had given you the work and the discipline and the land was always difficult. He had planted the spring fields 3 weeks after his father's funeral, with the specific quality of attention of a man who understood that the work was the tribute, that showing up at the field in the right frame of mind to do the work correctly was more in keeping with who his father had been than any other form of observation he could have made. His father's name had been Doyle. Doyle Vance had farmed this same ground from 1952, when he had bought the first 80 acres from a neighbor who was selling out after a succession of difficult years, until 2004 when he had sold the operation to Harold through the transfer arrangement they had worked out over the previous decade. Doyle had farmed in the specific way of his generation, which was methodically and with the assumption that the knowledge of one season was applicable to the next, but that the records of what had happened were worth more than the memory of what had happened, because memory was subject to the edits that humans unconsciously applied to their own histories, and records were not. Harold had those notebooks on a shelf in the farm office alongside the 43 volumes of the tile log. When he had read the Meridian permit application in March of 2022, the annotations in the margin of the 1981 notebook had been among the first things he had pulled. His father had been noting the drainage relationship of the adjacent parcel since that year. The drainage hydrology was not something Harold had invented for the permit dispute. It was something he had inherited from his father's careful observation and continued through his own. Karen Sue had read those annotations when Harold had shown her the original notebooks during her June site visit, and she had said that this was the kind of pre-existing baseline documentation that most drainage impact analyses lacked, and that the absence of which usually made it difficult to demonstrate what the conditions had been before a proposed development altered them. She said Harold's record gave her a 41-year baseline for the drainage behavior at the property boundary. Harold had not thought of this as remarkable. He had thought of it as what the notebook was for. The comment in the zoning board meeting room had surprised him more than the subsequent attention had. Not because it was rude, though it was rude, but because it was wrong in such a specific and demonstrable way. People like you don't belong in a room like this." Harold had been in rooms like that for 40 years, with his father before that. The documentation he had brought had been prepared with the assistance of a credentialed drainage engineer and had subsequently been confirmed by an independent engineering firm commissioned by the state. The comment had been made by someone who had not read what Harold had submitted and had looked at him across a room and made a judgment based on a category rather than a record. Robert Fenn had called Harold again in March of 2023, after the independent drainage assessment had been released and the meridian withdrawal had been announced. He said he wanted Harold to hear it first because Harold's documentation had been the foundation of the technical case, and he thought that was worth acknowledging directly. Harold had said he hoped the permit process for the revised application would go well for everyone involved, including Meridian, because a well-designed operation on that land was better for the county than a vacant parcel. And his concern had never been with the operation as such, but with the specific drainage design elements that the original application had not addressed adequately. Fenn had said that was a sensible position, and that it was not the most common position taken by landowners in permit dispute situations. Harold said he could only speak to his own situation, which was that his interest was in the drainage functioning correctly, not in whether Meridian built their operation. He said if the revised application addressed the drainage engineering correctly, it would not have his objection, and if it did not, he would be at the next hearing with the same notebooks. Fenn had laughed and said he expected nothing less. Daryl, the neighbor who had shown Harold the recording on his phone, had stopped by the farm again in March of 2023, after the Meridian withdrawal. He had stood in the farm lane with his hands in his jacket pockets and said that he supposed the notebooks had been worth keeping after all. Harold had said he supposed so. Daryl had asked if Harold had known, when he started the log in 1981, that something like this might happen. Harold had said no. He had not known specifically. He said you did not keep records because you knew in advance what they would be used for. You kept records because accurate information about your farm was useful to have, and because the uses were not always foreseeable in advance. Daryl had thought about that for a moment. He said his father had kept records too, but that Daryl had stopped keeping them himself after a few years because they seemed like extra work. He said he was thinking now that the extra work might have been worth it. Harold said it was worth it if you kept it up. He said the discipline of the thing was the thing. You kept the record because the record was the record, not because you could see the use of it from where you were standing. Harold's daughter Megan had connected him with a colleague at Iowa State who organized a workshop on citizen science in agricultural permit review. Harold had presented the tile log methodology to 47 people in April of 2023, with all 43 volumes on the table. When a woman in the second row asked how he had kept the record consistent over 41 years, Harold said he had kept it simple and treated it as non-negotiable, the same as an oil change on the tractor. He said completeness had been the standard from the beginning. She asked what he would say to a farmer thinking about starting a similar record, but who felt 40 years was too long to think about. Harold said his father had started with 1 year. The 41 years came from 41 decisions to do the same thing again. He drove back to the farm from Ames that evening with the 43 notebooks on the passenger seat and thought about the October hearing and the comment and the site visit and the outcome, the entire sequence that had resolved because decades of twice-yearly readings had been recorded in notebooks that were still on the shelf when they were needed. He thought about Doyle while walking the east section cover crop the following morning. His father, who had bought the first 80 acres in 1952 and had started the tile log in 1981, and had handed Harold a farm that was paid for and documented and understood in the specific practical way that decades of careful attention produced. He thought Doyle would not have said much about the outcome. Doyle had been a man who let the work say what needed to be said. The work had said it. He went inside and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table in the evening quiet of a farm that had been in his family for 70 years. The current notebook was on the desk. The August readings were months away, The record continued. That was enough. The Iowa State Workshop had produced something Harold had not anticipated, which was a request from the Jasper County Soil and Water Conservation District to present the tile log methodology to a broader audience of county farmers at the district's annual meeting in January of 2024. Harold had said yes, for the same reason he had said yes to the Iowa State request, which was that the methodology was useful to know about, and the farmers who could use it were the right people to tell about it. 63 farmers attended the January meeting in Newton. Harold had presented for 40 minutes, showing the log format and the monitoring point map and the specific way the data had been used in the DNR comment. The questions afterward had been the most substantive he had fielded, because the people asking them were farmers who operated drainage systems similar to his own, and who understood the technical specifics in a way that academic audiences sometimes did not. A man in the third row named Earl Jepson, who had been farming in the county for 35 years, had asked Harold whether he thought the Meridian outcome would have been different if he had not had the long record. Harold had said yes, significantly different. He said Karen Sue had told him directly that the 41-year baseline was what had made a robust, independent assessment possible, and that without the historical data, the drainage engineering analysis would have been based on current conditions alone, which was insufficient to demonstrate the long-term drainage relationship between the two parcels. Earl had said so the notebooks were the whole case. Harold had said the notebooks were the foundation of the case. He said the case was Karen Sue's engineering assessment and the DNR's decision to commission an independent review. But without the foundation, the case could not have been built. Earl had nodded and written something down. After the January meeting, 3 Jasper County farmers had contacted the County Conservation District to ask about establishing baseline drainage monitoring programs on their own properties. The district had requested guidance materials from Harold about the log format and the monitoring methodology. Harold had provided them a 4-page document he had written at Megan's suggestion after the Iowa State Workshop, describing the monitoring point placement principles and the data recording format and the consistency requirements that made a long-term record useful rather than merely large. He had titled the document his father's methodology, because it was his father's methodology, and it was appropriate to say so. The document was posted on the Jasper County Soil and Water Conservation District website in February of 2024, attributed to Harold Vance of Southern Jasper County, with a brief note explaining that the methodology had been central to the documentation used in a recent CAFO permit review in the county, and that farmers interested in establishing similar baseline records for their own drainage systems were encouraged to contact the district office. Harold had seen the posting when Megan had sent him the link. He had looked at it once and had not returned to it, because the posting was about the methodology, and the methodology was not news to him. It had been on the shelf in the form of 43 notebooks since 1981, and it would still be on the shelf in 2025 and 2026, and however many years followed, growing one notebook at a time, in late February and late August, regardless of what county websites said about it, or what permit disputes referenced it, or what workshops were built around it. Graham Coulter had resigned as CEO of Meridian Agri-Systems in July of 2023, citing personal reasons. The revised CAFO permit application, filed under new management in August, moved through the DNR review process without significant objection. The drainage engineering in the revised application adequately addressed the concerns that Karen Sue's assessment and the independent review had identified. Harold had reviewed the revised application when it was posted and had submitted a brief comment to the DNR saying that he had reviewed the drainage management plan and found it adequately addressed the subsurface drainage interaction he had documented in his original comment. The comment was 3 sentences long. The revised permit was approved in December of 2023. Construction began on the Meridian operation in the spring of 2024. Harold had watched the site work from his field boundary, with the same patient attention he brought to everything that happened on the adjacent parcel. Noting in his farm notebook the construction timeline, and the drainage infrastructure installation and the lagoon siting, confirming that what was being built matched what the revised permit described. It did. He noted that in the farm notebook too, and had set the notebook on the desk and had gone back to work. The 43rd tile log notebook was 3/4 full. The 44th was on the shelf, still blank, waiting for the February readings that would open it. Harold would walk the 12 monitoring points in late February, as he had walked them every late February since 1981, and would record the flow rates and the water quality observations, and the date and the conditions, and the 44th notebook would begin its contribution to a record that his father had started in the spring of the year. Harold had turned 26, and that Harold had maintained without interruption for 42 years. Some things in the world were complicated and required a great deal of analysis to understand. The tile log was not one of them. You walked the points. You recorded the readings. You did it twice a year in the same season under comparable conditions. You kept the notebooks on the shelf. You did not skip the February readings because you were busy, and you did not skip the August readings because it was hot, and you did not modify the methodology because a neighbor had a theory about better approaches. You kept the record because the record was the record. 42 years of that discipline and a 9-second recording in a county meeting room, and a Secretary of Agriculture who had grown up on a farm and understood what 42 years of records meant and who they belonged to. People like you don't belong in a room like this. Harold set the current notebook on the shelf beside the 42 that preceded it. He went to bed. In the morning, he would be up before light to check the east tile monitoring point, as he checked it every February. Because February was when the record said to check it, and the record was not in the habit of renegotiating its schedule. Neither was he.